Hollywood, 1973. Two titans of masculine cinema sat across from each other in a producer's office, representing everything audiences loved about American heroes. One meeting would determine if the biggest action film of the decade would ever be made. It would also reveal that some legends are too big to share the same screen. The mahogany-paneled office on the Warner Brothers lot hummed with nervous energy that seemed to seep through the very walls. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the California sun cast long shadows across the studio backlot where countless Western classics and action films had been born. The lot buzzed with the controlled chaos of a major studio at its peak, directors conferring with cinematographers, actors in costume heading to sound stages, executives in $1,000 suits making decisions that would affect millions of dollars and hundreds of careers. But today's meeting wasn't about the past or even the present. It was about creating the most expensive and ambitious action film Hollywood had ever attempted. Producer Frank Wells sat behind his massive mahogany desk, a piece of furniture so imposing it could have housed a small family. The desk was flanked by studio executives, whose combined power could greenlight $100 million projects with a single nod. Men who had built careers on their ability to recognize talent and predict what audiences wanted to see. On the coffee table between them lay the script that had everyone in Hollywood talking in hushed, excited tones. The Towering Inferno meets The Dirty Dozen, an action epic that would combine disaster film spectacle with military thriller precision, requiring not one but two major stars to carry its enormous scope and unprecedented budget. The project was ambitious beyond anything previously attempted in Hollywood. A disaster film combined with a heist thriller, requiring actors who could handle both the physical demands of extensive action sequences and the dramatic weight of life-or-death stakes. The budget was astronomical, nearly $50 million at a time when most films were made for under $10 million. The locations would span 3 continents. The special effects would push the boundaries of what was technically possible, and the potential box office returns were staggering enough to fund entire studio slates. But it all depended on getting 2 specific actors to agree to work together. 2 men whose screen presence was so commanding that the question wasn't whether they could carry a film, but whether any single film could contain both of them. Clint Eastwood arrived first, precisely at 2 o'clock, wearing his signature understated style, dark slacks, white shirt, brown leather jacket that had seen better days but somehow looked perfect on his tall, lean frame. At 43, he had just completed filming High Plains Drifter and was riding the massive success of the Dirty Harry franchise. Eastwood moved through Hollywood with the same economy of motion that made his screen presence so compelling. He didn't waste words, didn't play politics, didn't schmooze executives. He simply showed up, did exceptional work, and collected his increasingly large paychecks with professional satisfaction. "Frank," he said, shaking Wells's hand with a firm grip that conveyed both respect and the quiet confidence that had made him one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. "If you respect the real Steve McQueen, subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy." The conversation was pleasant, professional, and brief. Eastwood had read the script, understood the vision, and was interested in the project. His questions were practical: shooting schedule, location work, stunt requirements. He approached filmmaking like a craftsman, approaching a job that required skill, preparation, and dedication. "The role's interesting," Eastwood said, his voice carrying that familiar rasp that had made him famous. "Good action, solid character development. Who else is being considered?" Wells exchanged glances with the studio executives. This was the moment they'd been anticipating and dreading in equal measure. "Steve McQueen," Wells said simply. Eastwood nodded slowly, his expression revealing nothing. In Hollywood, certain names carried weight that transcended normal business considerations. Steve McQueen was one of those names. "Makes sense," Eastwood said after a moment. "Project this size needs 2 leads who can open a picture worldwide." What Eastwood didn't say was equally important. He understood the dynamics at play, the ego management that would be required. the delicate balance of two major stars sharing screen time. But he was a professional, and professionals found ways to make difficult situations work. 20 minutes later, Steve McQueen's arrival transformed the entire atmosphere of the meeting. The sound came first, the unmistakable rumble of a perfectly tuned motorcycle engine echoing through the studio lot. Then the silence as the engine cut off, followed by the distinctive rhythm of cowboy boots on marble floors. By the time McQueen appeared in the doorway, everyone in the room was already on edge. McQueen, at 43, was at the absolute peak of his powers and his arrogance. The getaway had just made him the highest-paid actor in Hollywood. Papillon was generating Oscar buzz. His upcoming towering Inferno role had already been negotiated at unprecedented terms. He was quite simply the most powerful movie star in the world, and he carried that knowledge like a weapon. He wore his standard uniform, perfectly fitted jeans, white t-shirt, brown leather jacket that managed to look both casual and expensive. His blonde hair was perfectly styled to look effortlessly tousled, and those pale blue eyes that had launched 1,000 magazine covers surveyed the room with the calculating assessment of a poker player reading tells. "Gentlemen," McQueen said, his voice carrying that distinctive hint of mockery that suggested he found the entire proceeding mildly amusing. The handshakes were performed, the pleasantries exchanged, but something had shifted in the room's energy. Where Eastwood had brought professional courtesy, McQueen brought electric unpredictability. Where Eastwood had been respectful of the process, McQueen seemed to be evaluating whether the process deserved his respect. McQueen settled into the chair across from Eastwood with the fluid grace that had made him famous, but his attention wasn't on Wells or the studio executives. It was fixed entirely on Clint Eastwood, studying him with an intensity that bordered on predatory. For 30 seconds, the two most masculine actors in Hollywood simply looked at each other across 6 feet of expensive carpet. Neither spoke. Neither smiled. Neither acknowledged the historic significance of the moment. They were taking each other's measure the way gunfighters sized up opponents in the westerns that had made them both famous. Finally, McQueen broke the silence. "Clint," he said, the name carrying just enough emphasis to suggest familiarity without friendship. "Steve," Eastwood replied, his tone neutral but alert. Wells cleared his throat and began his pitch, but it was clear that the real negotiation was happening in the space between the two stars. The script, the budget, the locations, all of that was secondary to the fundamental question of whether these two forces of nature could coexist in the same cinematic universe. "The concept is simple but powerful," Wells was saying, his enthusiasm building as he described the project. Two professional rivals forced to work together when disaster strikes. Natural enemies who discover they need each other to survive. McQueen's half-smile suggested he found the concept amusing for reasons that had nothing to do with the script. Wells continued outlining the dual lead structure. Equal screen time, equal billing, equal pay. Both characters would be heroes. Both would get the girl in different ways. Both would have moments of triumph and vulnerability. "It's really a buddy picture disguised as an action film," Wells concluded. "The chemistry between the two leads will be what sells tickets worldwide." McQueen picked up the script from the coffee table not to read it but to feel its weight in his hands. His pale blue eyes never left Eastwood's face as he thumbed through the pages with deliberate slowness. "Interesting concept," McQueen said finally. "Two alpha males sharing the spotlight. Very democratic." The word democratic carried enough subtle venom to poison a water supply. Eastwood shifted slightly in his chair, recognizing that this was about more than a movie deal. This was about territory, about hierarchy, about the fundamental question of who ruled Hollywood's masculine mountain. "The billing would be alphabetical," Wells said quickly, sensing dangerous undercurrents. "Eastwood, McQueen. Standard arrangement for co-leads of equal stature." The silence that followed was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop in the neighboring county. McQueen continued flipping through the script pages, each turn creating a small sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet office. His expression remained pleasant, almost amused, but something arctic had entered his pale blue eyes. Alphabetical, he repeated, as if testing the word's taste and finding it disagreeable. It's the standard approach. Wells pressed on, his voice gaining a pleading edge. 2 major stars, equal roles, equal pay, equal billing, everyone wins. McQueen closed the script with a snap that made everyone in the room flinch. When he looked up, his expression had hardened into something that the studio executives would later describe as terrifying in its calm certainty. "Frank," McQueen said, his voice dropping to that whisper that anyone who knew him understood as a danger signal, "let me explain something about how this business works." He leaned forward slightly, his attention focused entirely on the producer, while somehow maintaining awareness of Eastwood's every micro-expression. When people go to see a Steve McQueen picture, they're not buying tickets to see a movie. They're buying tickets to see me. They want to watch Steve McQueen be dangerous, be cool, be the guy they wish they could be. The explanation was delivered with the patience of a teacher instructing particularly slow students. Now, when those same people see 2 names above the title, their attention gets divided. They start wondering which one is the real star, which one is going to dominate, which one they should be watching. McQueen stood up then, his movement as fluid and controlled as everything else about him, and walked to the window overlooking the studio backlot. "That confusion is bad for business, Frank. And it's especially bad for whoever's name comes second." He turned back to face the room, and everyone could see that Steve McQueen had reached a decision. See, the audience comes in expecting to see Steve McQueen command every scene he's in. That's what they paid for. That's what I deliver. But if I'm sharing scenes with another major star, either I have to pull back, which disappoints the audience, or I have to overshadow my co-star, which makes the whole movie unbalanced. Eastwood had remained silent throughout this monologue, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never leaving McQueen's face. "It's not personal, Clint," McQueen said, finally addressing Eastwood directly. "You're a solid actor. You've got your own thing going. But," he paused, walking back to stand directly in front of Eastwood's chair. "In the same frame, there can only be one, toughest guy in the room. The audience needs to know who that is immediately, without question, without doubt. If they're confused about that for even a second, you've lost them." McQueen reached down and picked up the script from the coffee table, holding it between his hands like he was evaluating its worth as kindling. "And frankly, Clint, having the audience confused about who's tougher between us, that would be bad for your career, not mine." The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. Eastwood's expression remained neutral, but something had changed in his posture, a subtle straightening that suggested McQueen had finally provoked a response. McQueen continued, his voice still quiet, but carrying absolute conviction. "See, when audiences look at Steve McQueen, they see the real thing. Authentic toughness. I don't need to squint to look dangerous. I am dangerous. I don't need dialogue to establish dominance. I establish it by walking into a room." He gestured toward Eastwood without looking at him. "What you do, Clint, is create a character who seems tough. Very effectively, I'll give you that. But it's still acting. Still performance. Still something you put on like a costume." The insult was delivered so casually that it took a moment for its full impact to register. And in a movie with both of us, that difference would become obvious. Which would be unfortunate for everyone involved, but especially for you. McQueen tossed the script onto Wells's desk with deliberate carelessness. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to make this movie with just Clint. And it'll probably do fine. Not great, but fine. Or you're going to make it with just me, and it'll make 3 times as much money." He walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at Eastwood, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange. "But you're not going to make it with both of us because I don't share the spotlight. Not with anyone. Not ever." McQueen's pale blue eyes met Eastwood's steady gaze one final time. "Nothing personal, Clint. Just business. And in this business, there's only room for one Steve McQueen." The sound of cowboy boots on marble grew fainter as McQueen walked down the hallway, followed by the roar of his motorcycle engine starting up and fading into the distance. The room remained silent for nearly a minute after he left. Wells stared at the script on his desk. The studio executives stared at their hands, and Clint Eastwood stared out the window at the space where Steve McQueen had been. Finally, Eastwood stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked to the door. "Frank," he said, his voice carrying that familiar rasp, "give me a call when you figure out what movie you actually want to make." The project was officially canceled 3 weeks later. Two of Hollywood's biggest stars had proven that some egos were simply too large to coexist in the same fictional universe. Steve McQueen had made his point with typical ruthless efficiency. In his version of Hollywood, there could be only one king of cool. And everyone, including Clint Eastwood, had to acknowledge that he was absolutely right. Subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy for stories they never told you.